Hello, good evening, and welcome back. Well, unfortunately, it did go as expected with the London protests and the anti-protests. That, according to Scotland Yard, we've got more than 100 people arrested and 6 police officers injured during the London protests. Of course, a lot of this happened because of the convergence between the black supremacists and the libertarians. Yes, we can all change framing devices if you wish, but essentially, the main idea was you've got the Black Lives Matter movement, which is saying that we need to change the entire system, we need to get rid of the police and remove any statue or memorial or memory of anything which could possibly be construed in any way negative towards black people. And then you've got the counter-protesters who are saying, we don't think that the police are doing a good enough job protecting the statues and the memories of people who made this country great and the reason for why we're able to live as we are, and therefore we're going to have to impose our own presence in order to try and protect those areas. Of course, with the lack of weaponry allowed, that does then cause more skirmishes between people, because they know that maybe I can get a lucky hit or run by or something like that, instead of maybe I shouldn't go near this because I will be shot dozens of times by dozens of people. So there is a slightly different mentality there than we see in America, of course, where they can defend themselves and their property. So the idea behind this was to segregate the the blacks and the whites, almost the BLM and Antifa members, and then anybody else. So if they keep them separate, then the people wouldn't converge, therefore they wouldn't be able to attack each other, and therefore you would be able to keep things peaceful, and hopefully it wouldn't escalate, because of course then you've got vengeance and retribution and those thoughts coming along. So the idea was to avoid that. Unfortunately, that didn't quite go to plan. The reason for that was twofold. One is because although you had people defending statues, defending the monuments, because they didn't believe that the police would do a good job, then the BLM protesters wanted to do a march as a protest. So they wanted to move about, and in order to facilitate that, the police marched with them, and therefore needed to clear out the areas from the monument protectors, if you will, so that there wouldn't be an attack. And then the response is, of course, that the civilians who wish to protect these monuments do not think that the police will do a good enough job, and therefore do not wish to leave. And in those instances, you then end up with what is essentially the, as we can see here, the monument, which is people on it and around it, followed by police, followed by the BLM protesters, as we can see, until eventually the police got tired of it and did move on the people a couple of hours after the curfew essentially was supposed to take place, that being from 5 p.m, and it took them until about 7 to take away the last 50 people or so from Churchill statue. But of course, as we see that there are more violent protests happening, as we can see in this video here, that they're taking away the barricades because, of course, they're trying to get back to defend the statues, as they're not believing that the police are doing a good enough job. We see here that the idea of the police being able to direct the BLM protesters where they want to go didn't work as perfectly as hoped, and therefore you have had some skirmishes. Of course, we don't see Churchill's statue, instead we see a big box, because they thought, maybe we can protect it that way because we don't think we'll be effective enough. Here you see the counter-protesters mainly being pulled back, but hey, if anybody is being violent towards police like this, then investigate exactly why that's happening, and if they're not just defending themselves, then of course denounce it, no doubt about it. And here we are back at the monument again, and say that yes, these things should not be encouraged. They should definitely try to take hold of their own, as we do see happening. And I would encourage this to happen in any protest, that of course you're going to have some bad apples, but as you can see, for example, in these earlier clips that you've got a load of people running towards the police, but quite a few, like we see here, are trying to pull the people back. They're saying, we don't want to escalate this. We understand how the media is going to portray it, as we will get onto. And like the accountability that if you decide to join a group and you wish to be a representative of that group, then that also means you've got to take care of the other people in your group who would give your group a bad name. Unfortunately, if you do join a collective, you are now responsible for the collective's actions and not just yours. Otherwise, you will be tarred with the same brush. So, stopping these from getting violent is very important. Of course, you want to show your presence so that even if the initial protesters aren't put off by the police presence, hopefully they will be by yours. And the idea is that nobody gets hurt. There isn't any need for violence. It's almost like mad, mutually assured destruction. But, of course, because we actually don't live in a white supremacist country, there isn't an undercurrent of racism against black people. The conservative right-wing Prime Minister has come out to say, racist thuggery has no place on our streets. His way of mentioning it, just like the BBC here, to say that some peaceful anti-racism protests also took place in London and across the UK, are then saying police have been attacked by demonstrators in central London where thousands gathered despite warnings to avoid protests, including some far-right activists congregated in the capital. The narrative from the government as well, and the media, is to say these poor black people are being so peaceful and they have such good reason to be protesting and they're so nice about it, whereas these white people are far-right and evil, which I think just on its own destroys the narrative the BLM is trying to push. And the idea that they are repressed when they are given so much leeway from the media, from the Conservative government, is laughable. To try and suggest what other rights do they want? There are no rights that white people have that black people don't. There are rights that black people have that white people don't. If you wish to go down, for example, the quota route, if you want, different treatment for getting jobs or education or welfare, police presence. I mean, that's, the stop and search then, that you've got to, you can't interact with black people or BAME people, because if the person you interact with is black, then you're going to be done for racism, and that actually carries a hefty weight in the UK. Similarly, if it's then a Middle Eastern or so-called Asian, so Arabic, then of course you're going to be done for Islamophobia. So the only person you can really go after is the white person, the British person, the British indigenous person. Maybe European, otherwise you're going to be xenophobic. That's just the catch-all. So, no, there aren't any special privileges held by the British population that the immigrants, the foreigners, the second, third generation immigrants, whatever you may say, have. Not at all. So they say more than 100 people were arrested during the protest in the capital, Scotland Yard said, for offences including violent disorder, assault on police, and possession of a defensive weapon. 6 police officers also suffered minor injuries in the violent clashes, Met Police statements added. And they don't go to say exactly how these were caused, but I'll happily denounce any of them. If you're provoking the police and going after them without them having done anything to you, and they're abiding by the law and you're not, then of course you should then face the repercussions of the law. I have no doubt about that whatsoever. Considering there is only 1 or maybe 2 clips showing white people interacting with the police in a negative way, and yet there are 100 arrests, again, it seems to be a very favourable and biased view that they have, and the treatment of the law is unequal. The answer is not to protest with violence, no, not at all. It is instead to make it more wide known, try and get the truth out. The best disinfectant is sunlight, of course, and more speech is better speech. We have another bloke here who was urinating on the memorial for Keith Palmer, the guy who died being stabbed from one of the many terrorist attacks in London, but this one being the Westminster terror attack in 2017. Stopped it, of course, but did die in the process, unfortunately, and we have a man here urinating on it or next to it. If they're trying to paint him as a so-called far-right or a nationalist, and he's urinating on the memorial of someone who stopped an Islamic terrorist. Either he has no idea what this is, who this is, or he isn't such a nationalist. But trying to paint him as a nationalist doing this purposefully, I think is incredibly misleading. I don't see how there would be any motive. You've got a police officer who died defending the country from Islamic terrorism. That would be a hero, surely, to any nationalist. But apparently not. In this case, it just seems that if it is on purpose, it is someone who has no respect for the police, and we know which group that is. But hey, we can all be wrong, so we'll see how it pans out. So they say that large groups of right-wing protesters then moved to Trafalgar Square, where fireworks were thrown across the crowds. Funny way of saying things. Of course, you got Nelson's column, and that is predominantly what they were after. They were basically just saying, we're going to get here early, we're going to stay outside these monuments, the police then try and move them, and just so that the BLM protesters can get in there and assert their dominance, and that is where you get problems. That even as they mention from the Evening Standard, with the scuffles that you've got between the people, and you're going into Waterloo Station, so it's closed briefly as well, that although you've got a much greater police presence than you did when it was just BLM, because of course they want to catch white people in the act in order to prosecute them and make them look bad in order to empower black people even more and get a reason to put more money into the money hole, money which is wasted and just breeds more criminality instead of getting people to take responsibility of themselves. That is essentially it. That the idea here is, let's redistribute money from people who are helpful, helping each other, helping society, helping the economy through taxes, of course. Let's take their money, disincentivize them from doing anything worthwhile, and instead give it to people who would then be incentivized to do nothing worthwhile and are just given money instead. And let's also try and support these campaigns that say that the white man is evil. That's definitely a good use of the money. Let's try and take money from someone to give it to someone in a way that indoctrinates them to hate the person of whose money was stolen in order to give to them. That is a bit reductionist, but nonetheless, still, what's happening? Of course it is. So, as they say, moments after the square was cleared, the Parliament Square, a group of black men began to chase a white man. One man attempted to kick the chased man, but was unable to before police intervened. So we do have, I'm just trying to show that given the opportunity, these scuffles did occur, and of course that's why you're then seeing that the group, the collective, will stick up for that one member. And in the same way, if being part of a collective gives you that defense, as I said earlier, if you are part of that collective, then you've also got to realize that anybody who does anything bad is also your responsibility. So, without trying to give the BBC credit too much, we understand that they're incredibly biased, but we'll go and try and give them as much credit as possible. They say from mid-morning, hundreds of men, most of whom were already drinking, headed into Parliament Square. Some were members of football hooligan networks who had put aside their differences for the day. Others were from the far right. So, credit where it's due that you've got the football hooligan networks, various types, of course. Some saying don't come out for it. We understand that we're against all forms of extremism and racism, but this isn't going to be a good look. They're just going to try and target us. And of course, Tommy Robinson said exactly that, so don't do it. And then the BBC do distinguish to say others were from the far right. They still haven't been able to say what the far right is. So let's try and get in their head that the far right is apparently Hitler, National Socialist, Nazi parties, or National Socialist Workers' Party, Hitler. Right. So, that's who they support. The person who was not necessarily solely responsible, but a key part in taking him down was Winston Churchill, of course. So any of the far right would hate Winston Churchill, surely. And what we're seeing here is people who come to protect the statues, predominantly of Winston Churchill. So, unless far right then means not Nazi because the socialists are left-wing, in which case far right is just freedom-loving, in which case fair enough, if that's what far right means, but I don't think that's what they mean. And it's the same that we've seen before with the protests trying to say, the BLM protests are peaceful, but any of the violence is caused by white supremacists. But anybody who's arrested, we're going to pay for their bail in order to help them out. So, well, hang on, can you get your message straight? Because this is incredibly misleading, but hell knows you've been practicing it. So, they're saying, despite claims the day was about defending British heritage, it soon became violent. Groups looked for opportunities to attack the police. Bottles and cans were thrown at their lions and horses. Smoke bombs and fireworks set off. Journalists who came too close were threatened. Having watched about 9 hours of footage of this, there were 2 places where that happened, and it's incredibly difficult to find the context of it. So, X'd out on that one. Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer said any violence against police was completely unacceptable, adding no ifs, no buts. Well, hopefully, then, if there can be a positive of this, we're going to find that the BLM protests showed that coronavirus doesn't matter, we can go outside, not a problem. So that's good. And then the libertarian type, or the far right, whatever you want to call them, the protesters who don't support black supremacy, basically, then they're going to come out and might have a hard time with the police, but at least would then push the message that attacking the police is unacceptable and you've got to protect the rule of law. So it could be another positive, because then if they've done their part, they can go and then the police can crack down on BLM as they said they would. Will it happen? Probably not. Will it help to change the public opinion, which is what matters? Yes, of course, because if the white protesters aren't there looking for equality, equal treatment under the law and independence, and instead it's just the Black Lives Matter feminist Marxist movement, then we're bound to see a response that is, okay, there's violence being done, and either the police are going to step in like they said they would, or they're not. Either way, the public are going to see that they're on their own, and the police aren't doing anything about it. So that's the silver lining, if you will. So organisers from the Black Lives Matter movement had urged people not to join any rallies planned for the weekend over the fears there could be clashes with far-right groups. Wow, you could phrase that the other way as well. That would be easy. Because we've heard the same. And why didn't you mention Tommy Robinson, real name Steve actually Lennon, who said the same thing? Because we know how much you like to report on him, but I guess saying something that would be accurate is far beyond your scope, of course. So we've seen them all around the country, of course, and that they also like to mention that they've got the leader of Britain First, who is apparently far right, and just, I mean, you can obviously look through his manifesto yourself, but as they say, speaking before the clashes in the capital, the leader of the far-right group Britain First, Paul Golding, convicted last month of an offence under the Terrorism Act, so they had turned up to guard our monuments. That sounds terrible. Convicted last month of an offence under the Terrorism Act. Well, what actually happened? Believe it or not, he flew back from Russia into Heathrow. The police then tried to question him. Went, okay. They then wanted access to his phone and his computer, and he said no. And they said, well, give it to us or we'll charge you. And he went, well, okay, go on then. And they did. And that went to court, and the judge handed Golding a conditional discharge for 9 months and ordered him to pay a £21 surcharge and £750 in costs. So, after all that, if you believe it or not, because he came back from Moscow, that Abigail Bright, so the representative, the defendant, if you will, was saying, well, this seems to just be a targeted attack then. That the idea was, pick out someone you don't like, ask them for details they don't want to give you, hold them in contempt, essentially, or perverting the courts of justice, not complying, and then charge them with the worst thing that you can, which here is under terrorism, and then use that to beat them over the head with and to tar them with at every moment that you can. And so that's what they've done. So although they're saying, he was convicted of an offence under the Terrorism Act, it was just not wanting police in his phone or computer. And from what I've read, they didn't have grounds for searching these either. They just really wanted to, and therefore should be able to. So, That's very misleading. I'm sure you could paint it the other way as well. If he was black instead, and saying, oh, well, the police stopped him and they need access to his phone and his computer, this could easily go the other way. So, as they say that they had turned up to guard the monuments, and that is predominantly what they did, thankfully. But, of course, there were violent clashes because the police aren't perfect and people have to be able to defend themselves because sometimes you'll be somewhere, you'll need help, and the police can't be there because they'll be too busy. And unless you've got some sort of quick response, then you're at the mercy to the looters, the rioters, the intruders, the burglars, the attackers, whoever it might be. So do what you can in order to defend yourself. I understand in the UK it's mainly just down to martial arts, and now with the Holocaust coming in, the CCP virus, that you can't go to any classes to train. But I do implore you to do what you can in order to be ready for a situation like this whenever you can. And so thanks for watching, have a good one. But for anyone who wants to stick around and go through a bit of Britain First Manifesto, of course we'll look through it briefly here. I can go through it in more context in the future in more detail, but for the time being, the things that I wish to point out, the supposedly far right party, that their immigration is deporting all illegal immigrants and foreign criminals, not allowing anybody else in unless the asylum seeker claim is actually valid. So that's not of where the papers are, but instead of where they're from. They want to take back more sovereignty, withdraw from the EU. They're obviously very Christian and against abortion. So, although they wish to say that they will implement an American-style Bill of Rights guaranteeing freedom of speech, assembly and expression, no exceptions, there are exceptions to it. And when you're saying that, oh, it's freedom of expression, no, it isn't. That was not in the First Amendment because people express it in different ways. It isn't quite what you mean. What they mean is that you can essentially wear what you like that expresses those views, but not express it through vandalism or violence, for example, as we're seeing with the BLM movements. So, guaranteeing freedom of speech, assembly, yes. Expression, no. And then they say no exceptions, but there are exceptions as we'll get on to. So, religion, introduce a ban on the use of religious ritual slaughter. For that to actually take effect, they don't need to introduce a new rule, they just need to get rid of existing ones, because there is a ban on that, and then there are exemptions given for halal and kosher. Introduce a ban on religious courts, well, it basically just won't stand up under British law. Introduce a ban on the use of religious face coverings in public, so that goes against their earlier mention. Their health, they wish to support the NHS even more. But far right, okay, but they want nationalised health service. They want the British doctors, nurses and dentists instead of looting third world, as they say. The brain drain is definitely a real thing. A national scheme to promote healthy ways of living to tackle the root causes of our poor health as a nation, and that's always worthwhile to try and get to the root of it instead of just the symptoms. Good stuff. NHS protection bill to guarantee public ownership. They don't want any privatisation. Yeah, again, that's more government overreach. So not far right, not right wing at all. The education, they want more variety, but to focus on Christianity, not say that Britain was a terrible place, essentially, and greater influence of the armed forces. So in the economy, they want massive state support funding and training for new business and industries, so more government overreach. The government doesn't know where to invest, and if they fail, then there are no repercussions, whereas at least if you leave it up to the private investor, then through the magic of the free market, the good ideas will rise to the top. And the bad ones will fail, and people will be distraught and having a very difficult time because their ideas and entrepreneurship has failed, in which case they can find another job and save up before trying again. That is the cycle that these things tend to have to go to because you don't know what you're doing first time. Doesn't mean it's not worth doing, but you don't know what you're doing. And then financial penalties, and businesses outsource their operations to foreign countries. So they haven't mentioned minimum wage in here at all, but as long as they don't do that, that's fine. But if you're saying that you have to abide by certain regulations and that brings the cost up, and they can find that they can get around these increased costs by outsourcing it somewhere else, then of course they will. In which case, instead of deregulating and able to make it worthwhile to do it close to home, if they then say, oh no, now we're going to introduce a fine, then it's just going to be a game of cat and mouse, and they're going to be introducing more laws in order to fix old ones that should have been gotten rid of. The removal of stealth taxes, basically to try and make it a more even playing field, all for that, no doubt. They wish to transfer the sovereign power to create money away from the privately owned Bank of England to a new National Bank of Britain, which will be controlled by the UK government. It basically is already, due to lobbying and, again, government overreach, that it seeps into everywhere. You don't have any big individual companies anymore because of the lobbying that takes place. They're always in sync with the government. The idea of crony capitalism is socialism, and that's what we're seeing, of course. They want more referendums, which normally isn't a good idea because people don't really care that much, and to replace first past the post with proportional representation, which normally means you don't get enough people to make any decisions and you stagnate, which can be okay if it's down to trying to make new laws, because if you leave things as they are, then people can try to get used to them and make it work for them. But ideally, you'd be repealing them, of course, and so the people can do what they need to do. They don't want any foreign aid, of course not. Get your own house in order before you try and help out the world. Otherwise, how do you think you know what you're doing? That seems fair enough. You could even say it's humble. Balance the national deficit in a decisive and effective manner. Not going to happen. They want too much spending. And it doesn't sound good politically if you're cutting things. They always like a bigger deficit. Social, that it's basically most things are only available to British citizens. They wish to stamp out the national scandal of over 15,000 pensioners freezing to death each winter, which means, of course, more government overreach, more money for pensioners, and, of course, they've already said more for the education system. Implementation of a genuine workfare scheme whereby work is needed in return for benefits. So even the natives aren't getting a free lunch. Foreign affairs is exactly to be expected. Don't do anything, except that they want to replace NATO with something new. I'm not sure if it's necessarily obsolete or outdated though. You're still with America after all. They want more national service, that is the army essentially. They want to make prisons more difficult. They want it to be retribution instead of rehabilitation. It's up to you if you agree with that or not. Free the police from politically correct restrictions and unnecessary bureaucracy. They want them to be able to get on with their job at the risk of then police overstepping their mark, that they're okay with that trade-off. They wish to bring back the death penalty for severe crimes as well as castration for convicted rapists. So, yeah, a bit heavy-hitting in that regard. But reintroduce firearms for law enforcement and border agencies, but they don't mention it for an individual. Media. So, they want free speech, but they also say, introduce a new system whereby if a journalist is found to be deliberately and conscientiously fabricating content, they will receive a lifetime ban from working in the media professions. And make it a criminal offence with a guaranteed prison sentence for workers of the media who knowingly publish or produce false and or fabricated reports. Trying to prove slander or libel is notoriously difficult because you have to prove that you know why they were doing it in the first place. You have to prove that motive, that reasoning for it, which is incredibly difficult. More often than not, if it just comes down to, like we got Section 230 in America, to say you are a platform, not a publisher, then that will be enough. And that's really what you want to get to. So defense, they want to bring back national service and make it compulsory for a year for all citizens upon the completion of education, which is not really enjoyed by the army, to have people there who don't want to be there. At the moment, a volunteer army is sufficient, but the idea is to ingrain discipline. All being well, if you can bring back the family unit and stop the school education being undermining the idea of families and Britain, then you won't have to worry about discipline in terms of needing the National Guard. So I think that can be sorted out and you still have the volunteer army by, of course, pushing things like CCF, Combined Cadet Force, and other cadets before the army. I think they'll definitely help for discipline as well as recruitment for the army by having those national career days as well, and the training days and the days out whereby you see the army, interact with them, I think that'll also be a great help. So I think that'll be more than sufficient. But now that we got a bit off topic, just trying to show what apparently a far-right party is and just pick out the things of interest. If you're interested in more, you want me to see a full run-through, then do let me know down below. But otherwise, thank you for watching the extra long video, and as always, until next time, have a good one.